What's going on, my fellow Kino Lords? I welcome all of you to my 16 most traumatizing films I've personally ever seen. So, just for starters, this list is honestly majorly comprised of films that I've already watched and reviewed on this channel. So, for those films that I've already reviewed, I'm not going to spend that much time going in depth about it. I'll probably do my best to just kind of give a quick 2 or 3 minute summary or even less. But there are some in here that I haven't reviewed and talked about with you guys, so I'm really excited to talk about those especially. And also, not every film on this list is an underrated or underground type of film. Even though I think a lot of the films on this list are, there are a few in here that I think are pretty popular that I still personally find quite traumatizing. But before I go into this list, I'm going to annoy all of you with my Patreon shill. For those of you who don't know, I do have a Patreon, and for just $1 a month, you can participate in these weekly patron polls. I basically review a film every single week, and whoever wins the polls is the one that I review, obviously. And I also have a $5 perk on Patreon, where I host my own Discord chat server every other weekend. I'm holding one this Saturday at around 10:45 p.m., so there's something else if that interests you. But that's enough embarrassing, shameful shilling. Now it's time to get to the nitty-gritty and dive into this list. So we're going to start this list at number 16. So at number 16, we have May, which is a film that I literally just watched and reviewed a few days ago. And by the way, I'm going to do my best to put all of the films that I reviewed on this list in the description box below. But anyway, May is a film that I desperately wanted to put on this list, which is kind of why it's on the bottom. Because I just think it's an excellent film to watch during Halloween season. And it's one of those films that I think are just really underrated and not really well known amongst most people. And it's quite a shame because I think this is a really excellent film. I don't know if I would say that it's full on traumatizing, but it's definitely disturbing in a lot of different ways, especially with what it builds up to in its third act. And it has also just a brilliant performance from Angela Bettis that I think is definitely worth checking out. But yeah, like I said, I think if you're looking for a film that you want to watch that isn't really well known, but it's great during spooky season, I think May is the absolute perfect film to watch that will give you some disturbing psychological scares and is definitely worth your time. So I highly recommend it. Come on, baby, do the locomotion. So at number 15, we have David Lynch's Inland Empire. So this one was kind of tricky to decide on because I knew that I had to include a David Lynch film in here. And, you know, I could have picked Blue Velvet, I could have picked Eraserhead, but Inland Empire was just a film that, by the way, is around 3 hours long, but it just has this really disturbing psychological element to it because the entire film feels like it takes place in different multiverses, and the film does a great job at entrapping you into its world that can feel really helpless. And there are some imagery in this film that just makes this traumatizing psychological imprint on your mind that I think is something that is well worth checking out. And it does it in really unconventional ways too, because sometimes what makes this film traumatizing is that things are captured and executed in either just the most weirdest and ironic way, or just the way that it captures frightening images is just really unorthodox and really unlike anything you've ever seen. So I definitely recommend this film. I already reviewed it, so I'm not really going to go that in depth with it. But either way, I think that for me personally, this is one of the more disturbing / traumatizing David Lynch films that I've personally ever seen. At number 14, we have Harmony Korine's Gummo. So Gummo is a film that I also already reviewed, but this is a film that I think is pretty divisive because, it kind of goes without saying, but Harmony Korine is one of those really provocative avant-garde filmmakers that people are either just going to really hate or really love. And honestly, Gummo is the only film that I've seen so far from Harmony Korine that I actually think is pretty damn great. This film I would consider certainly disturbing / traumatizing, just because of not only the content that it delivers on, but just because the overall aesthetic and atmosphere that's achieved in this film, whether it's through its editing or through just the overall aesthetic look of it that looks like it's just captured like on a cheap 90s camcorder or something, that gives it this really raw and authentic vibe to it that really tricks your mind into thinking that, you know, everything you're watching is real and is not just a movie. Even though I will say there are a lot of actors in this film that aren't even really actors. These are just people that Harmony Korine picked up in this area and kind of used to his advantage in the film. And it just makes the film all that more realistic in the most unsettling kind of way. There's one scene in particular involving two brothers that fight each other. And that's a totally real scene. Like, that's not like choreographed. There's not any kind of stunt work. These are two brothers that are actually kind of beating the shit out of each other. And honestly, it's a really incredible but off-putting scene. You also have that infamous spaghetti eating in the bathtub scene that is really traumatizing in the way that it just makes an imprint on your mind. And it's basically a scene that you're never going to be able to erase from your memory just because of how it's executed in a really provocative and gross out way. But this is a film that I actually thought was really effective, and I think it's compiled together in a really creative way that really worked for me. But yeah, obviously proceed with caution. This is the film that you either will just turn off because you just don't like how it's put together, or you'll turn off because what it shows you is really off-putting and quite disgusting at times. At number 13, we have a Japanese horror film called Tetsuo the Iron Man. So this is a film that I've also reviewed already. It's actually kind of recent. Like, I think I reviewed this either a month or a few months ago. But this is a film that I absolutely loved. I gave this film a 10 out of 10 because the way that this film is put together and just the high-octane, adrenaline-fueled aspect of this film, I thought was just an experience to behold. And also just the awful but yet most thematic imagery I've seen in a horror film in a long time is portrayed in this film, and I really couldn't get enough of it. And obviously, I think this film is traumatizing because it does have sequences in this film that are kind of hard to get through. And a lot of it mostly involves just really unsettling portrayals of sexual violation. And it's not just one scene, but it's a few scenes. And those scenes will psychologically stay with you for a very long time, I promise you. But I think that for what the film was going for, it's certainly purposeful. It's definitely meaningful for the overall theme of what this film was trying to convey. And I just think it's a really creative and dark film that I truly enjoyed. By the way, I should have said this in the very beginning, but all the films that I have on this list are films that I actually think are good films. There's other films that are obviously like really traumatizing and disturbing, but I just don't think are very good films. A Serbian film is one of them. Salo is a film that I don't really think is horrible, but I'm just not a fan of it. I don't think it's really that great. So that's why you might not see those infamous ones on this list. But with that being said, I definitely say check out Tetsuo. I think this is a really overlooked film that a lot of people don't really know about. At number 12, we have Stanley Kubrick's A Clockwork Orange. So, for those of y'all who follow my channel and know what my favorite films are, A Clockwork Orange has made it to my number one favorite film of all time in both of the videos that I've made regarding my favorite films of all time. So y'all know that I am deeply, deeply in love with this film. This is one of those films that really made me want to start pursuing the art of filmmaking and made me realize how much of a love and passion I have for filmmaking and films in general. But this is a film that truly psychologically made an imprint on me because I remember watching this, I think at age 16, and this was a film that I just could not get out of my head because there are certain sequences in this film that I've just never seen portrayed in a film in this kind of way. And not only is that the reason why it stuck with me, but it felt all incredibly meaningful and creative. Because this film is definitely incredibly philosophical and definitely has many different messages to say about government, about free will, about government's place in policing free will, and whether or not, like, somebody is born good or socially engineered to be horrible. And I just loved all of the thematic elements that this film had to offer and the way that it uses its really traumatizing and disturbing imagery to really hit those themes home and also just give you a nice traumatizing scare. And this is one of the films on my list that is quite popular. Like, there aren't many film lovers out there who have never heard of A Clockwork Orange. Pretty much everybody's heard of A Clockwork Orange. But it's a film that I have to include on the list because I'd be lying if I told you that I wasn't psychologically disturbed by this film, because I really was. So at number 11, we have Come and See. So Come and See is also a film that I've already watched and reviewed on the channel. But this was a hard film to kind of pick because I really decided that I was only going to have one World War II/Holocaust film on the list. And I basically had to choose from either Come and See, The Pianist, or Son of Saul. And then it came down to really just The Pianist and Come and See, because even though I love Son of Saul to death, I gave that film a 10 out of 10. Also got a review for that if you want to check it out. I think The Pianist just emotionally disturbed me a bit more than Son of Saul. But Come and See ultimately became the winner of those options because what this film delivers on, especially in the third act of this film, is honestly quite unlike anything I've seen portrayed in a World War II/Holocaust film. It is extremely unforgiving in portraying the brutal truths of what happened to the country of Belarus, and it just takes a huge emotional and psychological toll on you that is going to be really hard for most people to actually sit through because, as I said, the content in this film is extremely unforgiving. And it's also just the way that the director goes about portraying everything that makes it that much harder to watch. But it's still a brilliant film. And it's something that I honestly think everybody should at least try to watch because it's history. Yeah, it's brutal and tough history to watch. But it's history, and I think it deserves everyone's respect. And I think it's really important to learn about an aspect of World War II that I think is under-taught, especially in America, because, as I mentioned in my review, I had no idea that this had happened to this specific country, Belarus. I mean, I knew that Hitler's ideology was spreading across Europe, but, you know, where I'm from, they don't go really in detail about what happened to certain countries, and this was one of them that was just completely ignored where I go to school. And definitely a film that I have to recommend to everyone, even though it is really hard shit to actually sit through. It's really well executed, really well directed, and the use of sound and score in this film is incredibly delicate, and it really helps immerse you into the whole psychological element of this film. So yeah, highly recommend this film. That's why it's number 11 on my list. So at number 10, we have Martyrs. So this is a film that I don't think I've reviewed, so I'll try to go more in depth with it. But Martyrs is a film that I remember going into with people telling me, like, dude, this is one of the most disturbing and violent films that I've personally ever seen in my life. And I was like, great, let's watch it. But I was worried that this wasn't really going to have that much purpose and meaning to it, and it was just going to be shocking for the sake of shock's sake. But obviously, I think this film goes a lot further than that. This isn't something that is just, trying to shock you without having any kind of thematic element behind it. This is a film that definitely has a lot to say about not only how much a human being can take, but also just about the human's desperation of wanting to know what happens in the afterlife, and how we had this huge intrigue with martyrdom. And I think that was executed in this film incredibly well. And it's funny because there are kind of two halves to this film. The first half is kind of this psychological horror element that is pretty fucking artsy, to be honest with you. It was a lot artsier than I expected. That has a lot to do with just like identity and having demons. But the second half of this is when it gets really, really hard to watch. And there was actually a segment on my first watch where I was like, where is this going to go? Because if this doesn't go anywhere that I think is meaningful, I'm going to be really upset. So I would recommend bearing with it for a while, because I do think that it does lead up to something that is somewhat rewarding. I guess rewarding wouldn't be the best word to describe it, but it was rewarding for me in terms of me feeling like I didn't waste my time on something that was just kind of like torture porn stuff, because to me, it's a lot more than that. But yeah, in terms of just brutal psychological horror, I think this film is definitely a film that you should watch if you really want to give yourself a psychological scare. This is the one you need to go to. And this is also a film that, you know, I don't think that many people know about. I mean, I guess a lot of people in the film/kino community know about this film, but I think a lot of horror fans don't really know about this film. I think it's kind of swept under the rug. So I definitely think it's worth your time and attention. And especially for Halloween season, I think this fits right in with trying to kind of psychologically disturb yourself. So I highly recommend this film. So number 9, we have David Cronenberg's Naked Lunch. So Naked Lunch is definitely a film that I think is really swept under the rug and is super underrated and really overlooked, but I can definitely see why it is, because not only does it have just some of the most gross out imagery that I've ever seen in my life, and a lot of really violating imagery that is kind of centered around bugs and insects, but the plot itself isn't something that is really easy for a lot of people to get invested in, because it's kind of all over the place and is a really paranoid and conspiratorial type of structure that kind of goes into the psychology of somebody who is just like super cracked out on drugs all the time and just thinks like the world is out to get him, and crafts his own narratives all the time about what he thinks is happening to his life. So I can see that being a turnoff for a lot of people. But for me, this was one of the most unique, horrific, and disgusting experiences that I personally have ever had. And I don't want to brag, but you know, I got the special Kino criterion right here. It's right there. But yeah, I also have a review on this film already as well. But know that this film, I think, will definitely be worth your time if you just want to watch something that will psychologically stay with you for quite a while. This is the film to go to. So at number 8, we have The Nightingale. So The Nightingale is a film that I was genuinely surprised that I was going to like it, honestly, a lot more than The Babadook. The Babadook is not in any means a bad film. I really, really loved it when it came out, but now I think it's still good, but I don't think it was as great as I initially thought it was. But The Nightingale, by the way, I mentioned The Babadook because it's written and directed by the same person, Jennifer Kent. I don't know how I forgot that. But The Nightingale is, I don't want to say is the best revenge flick, because there are so many great revenge films out there, including Oldboy and other really great ones. But The Nightingale really resonated with me, and I just thought the filmmaking behind it is absolutely fantastic. It has incredible performances, especially from the lead actress here. And yes, the traumatizing aspect in this film is something that is obviously going to be really hard to watch for a lot of people. And I remember this film kind of getting panned by a lot of people because, and not just regular people, I mean, critics were kind of trashing this film at first because they said that the really brutal and sexually violating and violent moments in this film were just really unnecessary and over the top. But although, yes, that shit is really hard to sit through when it happens, because it's really unforgiving, because it's not just sexual violence. There is something else that happens in the midst of all that that can be something that is incredibly hard to actually absorb because of just how brutal it is. But I think it's definitely meaningful and purposeful for what this film is going for. And I think it sets up something, it sets up a foundation to the film that I don't think would have been nearly as powerful by the ending if that wasn't there and if it didn't go as far as it did. And I just think that Jennifer Kent definitely did something here in the beginning that wasn't just shocking for the sake of shock's value. It's definitely there because it has a thematic purpose, whether it's for the character or just to have a more powerful build up to the ending. But either way, I think this film was absolutely incredible. I believe it's on Hulu. I'm not sure. I know it was on Hulu at one point. I don't know if they took it off, but I think you can watch this on Hulu. If it is on there, I highly recommend watching it on there. And I think this film deserves a lot more respect than what's been given to it thus far. I also already have a review of this film as well, but obviously I highly recommend this film.
Happiness, you know I'll get a hold of you some way. Until I do, you know I'll...
At number 7, we have Happiness. So Happiness is a film that I haven't reviewed yet, so I'll try to go a little bit more in depth than usual. But Happiness is a film that I've heard about for so long. Mostly from my cousin Eric, that y'all might know as the Vavitch, and also from my friend Perry, which y'all might have seen from some of my previous reviews. But this is a film that they've been bugging me to watch for quite some time. But they did warn me, like, this is a really traumatizing, disturbing, and off-putting film. And I'm obviously all here for it, so when I finally got to watch it, I really wasn't let down by this. I thought that this was one of the more unique and honestly, oddly hilarious films. Because this film is mostly edited, directed, and put together as this kind of pitch black comedy. And my experience watching this was actually mostly entertaining, and I was laughing a lot at the portrayal of all of these things that are occurring on screen. That being said, this film does go down a rabbit hole where it stops being just absurd and outrageous, and it starts getting really dark and serious, revolving around the subject of pedophilia. And obviously that's going to be a subject that is incredibly difficult for the vast majority of people to take in and absorb. And that's rightfully so. And that was one thing that I was worried about going into this film, was like, I hope that it treats the subject with some respect. And arguably it doesn't in a way, because some of it kind of gets played for laughs, but you're obviously also not meant to laugh at it. It's just presenting this awful topic in a way that makes you feel really disturbed and just really disgusting for watching. And I think that was the goal. And if that was the goal, then I thought it was really effective. But in a way, I think it also does treat the subject with respect, because, as I said, it gets to a point where it just stops even trying to play it for laughs, and it gets really serious and dark with it. And that was some of the hardest shit I've ever had to listen to and see unfold on screen. It doesn't show it doesn't show visually any pedophilia occurring. So, in terms of it being graphic in that content, it doesn't show any of that, but it's really through unforgiving dialogue and confession that this film can be really psychologically disturbing. And for me, that aspect did come off a bit traumatizing. But the performances in this film, all across the board, are fantastic. Obviously, Philip Seymour Hoffman is in this film. And just watching this film made me really, really miss Philip Seymour Hoffman, because he is just an extremely talented actor. And for him to be able to take on really off-putting and awkward roles like this that go down these really dark paths and portray these incredibly dark characters and really pathetic type of characters as well, something that's really admirable, because he's somebody that you could tell just truly loves acting and just loves the art of filmmaking. But either way, I do think that this is a pretty awesome movie. There's not really much about this movie that I disliked. And again, overall, as a dark comedy, a pitch black comedy, I think it's really effective, because I found myself laughing quite a bit at the overall absurdity and portrayal in this film. But then when it comes to just being really traumatizing psychologically, it also exceeds there, and I think that it's just great in that aspect as well. But just real quickly, huge props to the actor Dylan Baker in this film for being willing to portray that kind of character in this film. Because just looking at his face, anybody can judge this guy as being that pedophile kind of guy with really no evidence, just because he kind of has the look. And the fact that he decided to actually portray that character in this film is respectable for me, because that shows that he's willing to put his reputation on the line and willing to put his image on the line for the sake of artistic merit. And that's something that I find extremely admirable and respectable. But, maybe it's too spoilery for me to say this, but his character is definitely the most disgusting character in this film. But yeah, if I had to rate this film, I'd probably give it an 8.5 out of 10, just like a strong 8. I think this is one of the more unique and creative films that I've ever seen, and one of the most bold and daring films that I've ever seen as well. But again, do proceed with caution, because I do think this is a film that a lot of people might not be able to handle just because of how it portrays everything. So at number 6, we have 4 months, 3 weeks, and 2 days, which is a Romanian film that I have indeed already reviewed on the channel. But this is a film, as I stated in the review, that I didn't expect to be this masterful. I mean, I went in expecting a good movie, but this to me is a masterpiece. And not only is it a masterpiece, but it is one of the more psychologically emotional films that can be quite difficult to sit through. I know I kind of keep saying that throughout this list, but I mean, obviously I'm going to keep saying that this is a traumatizing films list. All of them are going to be really hard to sit through, but obviously for its own reasons, that obviously has to do with the honest historical depiction and portrayal of Romanian society, where abortion is banned and illegal, and just what women would even have to go through in order to get an abortion, was really haunting for me and really made a psychological imprint on me. But it definitely does it in a sparing and subtle way. This film is actually a lot more subtle than you'll actually expect, but sometimes less is more, and I think with this film, that's exactly what happens, because even though this film is pretty forgiving with how much it could actually show you if it wanted to, the effect still stings, and it definitely certainly gets its point across regardless, and manages to be incredibly powerful in that regard. And yeah, so if you want to hear me talk more in depth about it, I obviously recommend watching my review for it, but this is certainly a film that really impressed me on every phase of filmmaking, and also managed to psychologically traumatize me for a while. At number 5, we have Hereditary. So this is a film that's really popular and is definitely not something that's been swept under the rug. But I'm sorry, this film is one of the most emotionally traumatizing films that I've ever seen. That sequence, we all know what sequence we're talking about here, I've never seen emotional trauma and just psychological disturbance be portrayed in the way that it is in this film. I feel like it's one of the best portrayals of psychological and emotional trauma that I've personally ever seen. It's also one of the best portrayals of grief, and a lot of that is huge thanks to Toni Collette's amazing performance in this film.
Don't you swear at me, you little shit! Don't you ever raise your voice at me! I am your mother!
Honestly, one of the best performances that I've seen in a very long time. Horribly snubbed by the Academy. And obviously I have a review on this, so I'm not going to go that in depth. But just know that even though this film is quite popular and a lot of people have seen it, I'm one of those people who, every time I watch it, it's something that will always stick with me, and something that will always have that emotional, powerful impact when I'm watching it, regardless of how many times that I've seen it. And I think it's one of the more effective ways to portray emotional trauma in terms of its editing and direction, especially the direction. Ari Aster is just amazing at portraying trauma. Number 4 is Dogtooth, which is written and directed by Yorgos Lanthimos. So Dogtooth is a film that, out of all the Yorgos Lanthimos films, for me was the most emotionally disturbing and traumatizing film that I've seen from his filmography, at least, because he's got some disturbing films, obviously, in his filmography. The Killing of a Sacred Deer is one of them, and even The Lobster has some really off-putting and disturbing moments. But Dogtooth, to me, was certainly the most disturbing out of the bunch. And I also have a review on this, so I'm not going to go that in depth. But yeah, just know that what the innocent characters have to go through in this film, and just what they're oppressed and confined by, is something, it's a concept that is not only something that is believable and real, but it's something that is really hard to watch, not only because of its content, but also because of the fact that there's a lot of psychological manipulation going on in terms of brainwashing. And that kind of shit can be some of the hardest shit to sit through and watch, because it's one of the really disturbing facts of life, because it shows you how easy and simple it can be to control somebody's knowledge in the worst way possible, and just confining somebody and feeding them false information after more false information all the time, just so you can have control over this person, is something that is really, it's a disturbing concept, because it's a disturbing reality. And obviously it's kind of a metaphorical representation of fascism and kind of authoritarianism, and even, I guess, communism, and how dangerous it can be when you have authority figures controlling the flow and source of your information. And even beyond the really explicit sexual content in this film, even that concept alone just adds to how psychologically disturbing this film can be for somebody to watch. I think it's an amazing film. It might be my favorite Yorgos Lanthimos film. I still haven't really decided that, because he's made so many great films. But if you're somebody who can deal with a lot of sexual content, I think that you should definitely give this film a watch, because it is pretty unforgiving with that aspect. So at number three, we have Cachet, which is written and directed by Michel Haneke. So Cachet is a film that I think I've only talked about in my previous favorite films list, so I'm not going to go that in depth with it, but this is still my favorite Michel Haneke film, and it's also the most psychologically disturbing film, in my opinion. And that's kind of a bold statement, because Michel Haneke has made a lot of just really disturbing films. Piano Teacher is one of them. I guess it's one of his more subtle ones, but it's definitely psychologically traumatizing in a way. Funny Games, also a pretty disturbing film to kind of sit through. It might be one of his lesser disturbing ones that I've seen. Some people will consider it his more disturbing ones, but maybe they haven't seen Cachet yet. Because what I love so much about this film is that it has this ability to be incredibly emotionally disturbing and traumatizing, but in an incredibly subtle way. Like, this film doesn't try so hard with showing you so much graphic content to actually disturb you, but it's the context that it provides and the subtle imagery of how certain events are portrayed that make it all the more unsettling and kind of give it this really raw and realistic perception. And this is a film that I appreciate mostly because of that aspect, because I think it's a really subtle film that manages to be one of the more traumatizing films that I've ever seen. And that's really one of that's really one of Haneke's strengths, is that he is incredibly well at utilizing subtlety to his advantage, but still managing to make something that's really emotionally disturbing. Cachet, in my opinion, is an incredibly well-directed film, incredibly well acted and written. It really does staple a psychological imprint on your mind because of how things are portrayed in this film. And there is this one particular scene, for those who've seen it, probably know which scene I'm talking about. And it's just the framing of this and that shot alone will always kind of trigger me a little bit and give me goosebumps, because just seeing the framing of that kind of takes me to a dark place in what this film offered. And this is one of the best films, honestly, that I personally ever seen, but it's also one of the more traumatizing ones. So at number 2, we have Lars von Trier's Antichrist. So this is a film that I've already done a review on. I actually have like a triple review video where I reviewed 3 different von Trier films. That's part of that video. But Antichrist, I think, is now my favorite von Trier film. Before it was Dogville, which is also a psychologically disturbing film and that I highly recommend. But after allowing Antichrist to sit more with my mind, I think that it is my favorite von Trier film, because I think I might be a little biased because I personally loved the themes revolving around nature and the chaotic aspect of nature and just how human beings perceive nature as evil. I think that I just really have a connection with those themes. But obviously this film is quite famous, or infamous, however you want to put it, for having some extremely unforgiving and graphic content. And it surely does. It will definitely deliver on that, and it will definitely meet or exceed your expectations if that's how you go into it. And, yeah, this film is disturbing because it does have all of that graphic content that you are always going to remember for the rest of your life, but also just the portrayal of its themes, because it has this really sinister and dark tone to it that is quite unforgettable. And obviously, like, the performances in this film are off the charts. Willem Dafoe is an actor that I admire so much. Honestly, he's probably one of my favorite actors we have, at least still acting, because you can tell that, I mean, I've seen a lot of interviews with him talking about this film, and you can tell that he just has a deep love and appreciation for not just Von Trier films, but just for art in general. And he just has a huge respect for it. And I mean, him just being in this film and being willing to portray himself and put his reputation on the line like this is something that is extremely admirable. Charlotte Gainsbourg in this film, off the charts great as well. She's another actress that I think is quite underrated and deserves a lot more respect. Just the road that both of these characters go down in this film is really disturbing shit, but really impressive on an acting standpoint. And Von Trier is, I think, one of the more misunderstood directors. And honestly, I was one of those people, because before my cousin Eric really convinced me to watch his films, I had just thought that Von Trier was just a director that was shocking for the sake of shock. Which, don't get me wrong, sometimes he can come off that way. But every Von Trier film that I've seen, and I've seen a lot of them, there's definitely always meaning behind it, in my opinion. You could argue that there are some scenes that just go too far and are trying to just provoke a reaction out of you. But like Nicholas Winding Refn likes to say,
creativity is about reactions. And reactions is the essence of an experience. The essence of an experience is planting thought. If you don't react, what are you doing here?
As long as there's some sort of meaning and purpose behind the madness of what you're seeing unfold, I think that is perfectly valid and can create some of the most meaningful but really shocking pieces of art. And to me, this is the kind of shit that will live on forever because of, yes, the unforgiving content, but also the artistic value and merit that it offers as well. So yeah, I love Antichrist. I've seen it only one time, but I remember almost every frame of it. But I'm really excited to watch it again. I know that's kind of a weird thing to say, but this is a film that, you know, it's traumatizing, but it's also pretty goddamn rewarding. But if you haven't seen it, I obviously recommend it. But that's why it's number 2 on my list. Alright guys, it's time for me to reveal my number 1 most traumatizing film that I've ever seen in my life. I think there's a handful of y'all that probably already know the answer to this, but without further ado... So my number one most traumatizing film is Gaspar Noé's Irreversible. So Gaspar Noé, a lot like Lars von Trier, is a provocateur. He is somebody who likes to make these really shocking films with extremely graphic content that a lot of people will come out either extremely hating or extremely loving. And in my opinion, from all the Gaspar Noé films that I've seen, which are Climax, Into the Void, and Irreversible, in my opinion, there's definitely a lot of purpose and thematic meaning behind all of his madness that's going on and unfolding on screen. I mean, obviously, in the case of Irreversible, I think it's perfectly debatable to argue whether or not that incredibly long 9-minute segment of brutal and disgusting sexual violence should have been that long, whether or not the length was necessary. But I definitely believe that Gaspar Noé did that with artistic intention, and he definitely was trying to make a certain statement about audience members themselves and tries to remind us why we even go to the theater and why we even are even entertained by violence to begin with. But needless to say, this film has multiple scenes that aren't just that scene that will just make you sick to your stomach and will just make you gag and make you want to shut it off and will just overall make you extremely repulsed. But still, with all that being said, I think that this is a fantastic piece of filmmaking. The camera work in this film is unlike anything that I have ever seen in my entire life. It is all over the place. I mean, it is incredibly... The camera is active and just going bananas the entire film. Unfortunately, it's not going bananas during that brutal scene that we all know about. It's just standstill because Gaspar Noé is just an asshole sometimes. But the camera work overall in this film is just out of this world and just really energetic. And again, unlike anything that I personally ever seen in a film. And I understand some people might, come off saying, dude, it's way too nauseating. Like, it made me want to puke, just the movement of the camera alone. I can sympathize with that. It also made me quite dizzy and maybe a little bit nauseous. But that didn't stop me from really appreciating and admiring the camera work in this film, because I do think that it takes a lot of finesse and skill to pull it off the way that he did. But even beyond the camera work in this film, the acting in this film is absolutely incredible. Monica Bellucci, I admire that actress so much for even taking on this role and being willing to portray herself on camera in that way. Vincent Cassel, he's great in pretty much everything that I've seen him in. I recently saw him in a film called La Haine, which I thought was incredible, and he's incredible in it. But yeah, Irreversible is arguably a flawless film, and even the structure of this film is really creative, and it's something that you think might just be a gimmick, but the structure seems to really work in its advantage, and overall has this incredibly purposeful intention behind it that I think in the ending really pays off, and it makes the ending itself even more shocking, and even arguably shocking than some of the graphic stuff, just because of some information that gets conveyed. But overall, I think that this is an absolutely fantastic film, but definitely the most traumatizing film that I personally ever seen, just because of that incredibly long and unforgiving depiction of sexual violence in this film. And it's not even just that, like, it gets even more brutal after the sexual violence that makes it that much harder to watch. But either way, yeah, that's why it's number one on my list. And I obviously recommend this film, but definitely to somebody who is able to handle this level of unforgiving graphic content. But yeah, guys, that'll be it. That's my top 16 most traumatizing films that I've ever seen. Obviously, I have to tell everybody to proceed with caution with all this. But obviously, you clicked on this video to probably get some recommendations for you to watch. So I think most of you all understand that you go into this with some trigger warnings and with an understanding that all these films are incredibly unforgiving with the kind of content that they show. But obviously, I think a lot of these are great films to watch during spooky season because it does a great job at psychologically disturbing you. And if that's what you're going for, I think all these films would do the trick. But anyway, thank you so much for watching this video and hearing out my most 15 traumatizing films that I've ever seen. If you really enjoyed it, please give it a thumbs up and share it amongst your friends. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel to be updated on more film-related content.